My name is Emily Pothast, and I'm a PhD student in Historical and Cultural Studies of Religion at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. This video summarizes a paper I delivered at the Center for the Critical Study of Apocalyptic and Millenarian Movements virtual conference held on June 30th, 2021. The title of that paper was Toward a Theory of the Apocalyptic Apparatus. I'm going to begin by defining the terms I'm using here. Apocalypse has been defined as a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial, insofar as it involves another supernatural world. Some of the ancient texts which fit this genre description include parts of 1st Enoch, Daniel, 4th Ezra, Jubilees, and the Book of Revelation, which is the first text to actually use the Greek word apocalypsis, literally an unveiling, to describe itself. Any definition like this can be overly limiting, and this particular definition has received some criticism since it was first formulated. However, one thing that I find helpful about it is the way that it delineates the narrative framework that these so-called apocalyptic texts tend to have in common. I would like to propose that ancient apocalyptic texts performed within their original social contexts in a very distinctive way, and that this performance was enabled by a narrative structure in which a revelation mediated by an otherworldly being is shown to a human recipient, our visionary. Oftentimes, these otherworldly beings are described as angels, and angelos literally means messenger. So this figure's job as a mediator is to serve as a point of contact between the visionary and the vision. This tripartite model of revelation, mediator, and recipient provides the foundation for what I would like to call the apocalyptic apparatus. The concept of the apparatus may be traced to the philosopher Louis Althusser, who defined ideology as the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. According to Althusser, such imaginary relationships always exist in an apparatus, that is, a structure consisting of practices embedded in material culture. The concept of the ideological apparatus helps explain how powerful institutions like nations or empires are able to reproduce the conditions necessary to ensure their own continued dominance. And so one way in which ancient apocalyptic literature can be said to have performed in its original context was as a kind of counter apparatus to those of the powerful empires that continually sought to dominate the land of ancient Israel and its people. The ideological apparatus of empire would have included things like monumental architecture, inscriptions, imperial cult festivals, and mass-produced coins that represent the emperor as a deity. Objects like these and their associated practices aim to create a social environment in which the power of empire was understood to be divinely ordained and inevitable. In her book, Apocalypse Against Empire, Theologies of Resistance in Early Judaism, Anethea Portier-Young argues that the authors of early Jewish apocalypses both resisted and undermined imperial cosmology by facilitating a, quote, radical relocation of ultimate power. In apocalyptic narratives, ultimate power was ascribed to the God of Israel, while the earthly authority of empires was framed as partial, contingent, and finite. In other words, apocalyptic literature performed a strategic inversion in which the power structures of empire were subordinated to a higher power. Having now outlined in very broad terms the competing systems of power articulated by the ideological apparatus of empire on the one hand and apocalyptic narratives on the other, I would like to return to the apocalyptic narrative structure in order to point out something very interesting about this framework. If we think of media as interstitial sites for the codification, storage, and transmission of information, then we can see that the apocalyptic narrative framework provides us with a model or even allegory for how media functions. When we approach apocalyptic texts as a reader or a listener, another interesting thing happens. Through their vivid descriptions of sensory phenomena, we are encouraged to vicariously identify with the seer's experience, and the text through which we encounter the vision becomes our mediator. The apocalyptic narrative framework is thus both a model and analog for the functionality of a visionary text as media. We could even say that apocalyptic narratives are works of metamedia, media about the functionality of media. In the 1970s, the film theorist Jean-Louis Baudry used the term cinematographic apparatus to describe the mechanism through which cinema achieves its ideological effect. In order to illustrate this mechanism, Baudry invoked a very different ancient allegory of media, that of Plato's cave, which appears in Book 7 of Republic. In his allegory of the cave, Plato describes a group of relatively passive and powerless viewers who have been chained inside of a cave since birth. These viewers are able to see shadows cast onto the cave wall in front of them. However, they are unable to glimpse the cause of these shadows, hidden figures who manipulate the shadows from behind the scenes. Baudry points out the parallel between this ancient allegory and his concept of the cinematographic apparatus. Just as the figures chained inside the cave are unaware of the machinations responsible for the images that appear before them, the cinemagoer is presented with a simulacrum of reality, a prosthetic dream whose artificiality is concealed within processes of framing and editing, which are hidden in the final product. For Baudry, it is this hiddenness that accounts for cinema's ideological effect. The less aware we are of the artifice and manipulation that go into producing works of cinema, the more we resemble the figures in Plato's cave, passive absorbers of information prone to mistake the fabrication on screen for reality. Both of these models of mediality, the one provided by Plato's cave and the one inscribed by the narrative framework of literary apocalypses, have a similar tripartite structure. In both cases, something is witnessed by a recipient, and that something is mediated. But there's a big difference between these two models, and I think that that difference can help us understand what is so distinctive about the apocalyptic narrative frame. In the allegory of the cave, the viewer is a passive recipient of images mediated by a hidden process whose ultimate source and cause are unknown to them. In contrast, the angel or figure which mediates the vision in apocalyptic narratives tends to interact directly with the human recipient, providing guidance, interpretation, and instruction. There are many textual examples in various works of apocalyptic literature that illustrate this interactivity, and I'm going to just very quickly point to a few of them. In the Book of Watchers, which is part of the collection of texts that we call First Enoch, the visionary Enoch is shown the secrets of the universe by the archangel Michael. During this exchange, Enoch expresses the desire to know more about a particular tree, and his interest is acknowledged by the angel. This passage demonstrates the role of the seer's own agency in his visionary experience. Enoch's curious questions and the angel's responses to those questions actually help determine the ultimate nature and content of his vision. A similar conversation takes place in the apocalyptic vision of Daniel 7, in which Daniel relies on an angelic guide, described in this passage as one of the attendants, to offer an interpretation of his dream of the four great beasts arising from the sea. Through this mediating figure, we learn that the beasts of Daniel's dream represent the kings of four earthly empires who will be overcome by the holy ones of the Most High. Like Enoch, Daniel's curiosity and back and forth dialogue with this angel really helped to structure his visionary experience, providing a model for the interpretation of political events in the context of a great cosmic drama. Reading and inscription are also recurring themes in these angelic interactions. In the Book of the Luminaries, also found in First Enoch, the archangel Uriel instructs Enoch to read and understand heavenly tablets on which all the past, present, and future actions of humanity are written down. In this passage, the scribal practices of reading, understanding, and writing are associated with the archiving of destiny. In the book of Revelation, John's guide, the one like the Son of Man, instructs him to write down what he sees, encouraging him to become an active participant in the vision through the act of inscription and then sharing it with others. There are many more examples that could be drawn from these and other so-called apocalyptic texts, but this video is designed to provide just a brief introduction to this research. In this presentation, I have borrowed the concept of the apparatus from film and media theory as a way of conceptualizing the mechanism through which the apocalyptic narrative frame achieves its effects. Apocalyptic texts have been defined, at least in part, by the presence of a mediating figure through whom the visionary encounters the vision. When we encounter these texts as readers or listeners, the text becomes our mediating figure, so we can see this narrative structure as an allegory of how media function. The themes of angelic conversation, interpretation, and inspired inscription in apocalyptic texts all point toward a productive, interactive engagement by the visionary with the contents of their own visions. By contrasting the apocalyptic narrative framework with the framework described in Plato's cave, we can see the sense of agency that this interactivity can impart. If the ancient imperial apparatus sought to produce a docile subject mindlessly captivated by imperial spectacle, then the apocalyptic counter-apparatus, in contrast, challenged its participants, in the words of Portier Young, not to withdraw, but to engage. If apocalyptic visions may be compared with dreams, then they are lucid dreams in which the ultimate meaning of history is simultaneously revealed and produced through a proactive dialogue between the heavenly and human realms. The authors of these texts were, of course, scribes, and in these narratives, we observe these scribes creatively conceptualizing their own relationship to reading, writing, and interpretation, and its role in the ongoing production of cultural meaning. In each of the textual examples I have cited, the power inherent in scribal mechanisms of transmission is not only made visible, but is personified as a helpful character who accompanies the visionary through the collaborative process of cosmic mapping and creative historiography. We see in the apocalyptic apparatus not merely an analogy of media, but a dramatization of an interactive approach to media, one that makes the apocalyptic narrative frame a useful and appealing resource for those who would seek to become active participants in the shaping of history.